Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, as a fan of AMD's APUs, I was quite surprised to find that we've never looked at the 5600G. This is a 6-core 12-thread chip that started appearing over 5 years ago as part of pre-built systems before getting a retail release a few months later. It made the most sense as part of a capable everyday machine that could handle lightweight games with solid frame rates, or as a sort of stopgap during turbulent times with discrete graphics card prices. In my opinion, it still appeals to the same audiences, though it's a significantly cheaper purchase than it was half a decade ago. That said, if you plan on using a discrete graphics card as part of a new build and you have a bigger budget, then I'd recommend a regular 5600 or 5600X instead. A regular 5600 has double the L3 cache, PCIe 4.0 support, and therefore better gaming performance potential. The main focus today, however, is the 5600G and the performance of its integrated Vega 7 graphics, because I've not used this APU for gaming before and I want to see what it's like in 2026. Now, we have used the 5700G, which has more cores and Vega 8 graphics, but what can we expect from this in both easier to run games and more demanding titles? I've overclocked the iGPU from 1900 to 2200 MHz, and this does make the temperatures a little spicy with the boxed cooler, so I'd certainly recommend something better if you want to up the clock speeds, though faster RAM would probably be more effective than an increase to the iGPU clocks. Yeah, don't be alarmed by the almost 90-degree temperatures in gaming. This wasn't enough to throttle the chip, but it's certainly not run with temperatures like these long term, that's for sure. So let's start off with Arc Raiders today, 1080p with the lowest settings and FSR set to balanced for an average of 36 frames per second. So this will run with at least 30 frames per second. As I said before, the temperatures are pretty warm today with the Wraith Stealth and the overclocked iGPU, looking at least 85 degrees in some scenarios. But as I also mentioned, I think your better bet is, to be honest, faster RAM as opposed to an iGPU overclock. I'm running with 32 gigs today of 3200 MHz DDR4 with 8 gigs reserved for the iGPU, but I think 3600 MHz DDR4, maybe even faster, is certainly going to make a bit of a performance difference as well. For our first game then, Arc Raiders, it's a pretty smooth plus 30 FPS. The 1.1% lows do represent a fairly consistent gameplay experience today, so not a bad start for a half-decade-old APU. Counter-Strike 2 is exactly the sort of game that the 5600G will play with ease at 1080p and at least 60 frames per second. We were getting 80 overall here. The 1% low was actually 61 FPS. Our 0.1% low was 5, but this is because every so often, mostly before I got wiped out, the game would dip quite heavily. So if you're a better player than me, which isn't difficult, as I've said before, then you may not experience these dips. But as you can see here, this performance segment was pretty smooth overall, and most of the time it's going to run absolutely fine with the 5600G and Vega 7 graphics. Time for a bit of a challenge for the 5600G now. Well, as if Arc Raiders wasn't already a challenge at the start, but we have Battlefield 6 next, with the lowest settings, of course, and 60% resolution. I was surprised to see this one actually running with at least 30 frames per second. Now, adjusting the resolution scale slider is going to be a better option than choosing FSR, as it will just run smoother like this and a bit more consistently. We were looking at 34 FPS, which may not be playable to a lot of people, especially in an online game like this where higher frame rates are essential really, but I was surprised to see plus 30 frames per second. The iGPU is certainly going to be the limitation for this chip, and even at these temperatures there's no throttling at all here. Yeah, it was pretty much 30 FPS all of the time, to be honest, at least with Battlefield 6 here. A surprising result, still not necessarily a playable one, but better than I was anticipating, let's say that. Now Skyrim Special Edition is of course quite a bit older, but I wanted to see how well it ran because I think this is another good example of a title that is best suited to the 5600G. With the medium preset here and TAA, we were seeing 44 frames per second. Surprisingly, with the high preset, we were seeing sub 30 FPS. So if you want to play Special Edition Skyrim, you're best off doing so at medium with this resolution, or you could always play the original game, which is going to run at a lock 60 FPS absolutely fine with higher visual quality settings. Now, just like with Skyrim, GTA 5 comes with an original or enhanced version, and just like with Skyrim, we're running the enhanced version. With the lowest settings at 1080p, the population variety slider set halfway and TAA enabled, we were getting 37 FPS. Now you might think that it should run a bit better than this, but GTA 5 has historically, in my experience on this channel, ran quite poorly or not as good as expected on AMD's APUs. It doesn't really enjoy integrated graphics all that much from my experience. The same can be said for this or the original version. That's just what I found on various integrated hardware configurations, but I think this is still pretty much playable with at least 30 frames per second. It's quite consistent as well. If you wanted to enable an FPS cap, perhaps 30 FPS, then it may feel just that little bit smoother, but not too bad for the 5600G and the enhanced version of GTA here. Next up we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with the low preset and FSR enabled for 34 frames per second, a 1% low of 26 and a 0.1% low of 25. Now this is going to feel okay, but there are a few dips and drops, particularly in towns and when you get into fights like I'm doing here with the guard, who seems to have a really long pole, and I don't fancy my chances, to be honest, with my tiny hunting sword. So I'm probably going to get wiped out any second now, but you still get a good idea of the frame rates with the 5600G, and it's nice to see that this game is running okay on this hardware. Now the other guys getting involved, I'm definitely going to die any second. Overwatch, another good example of the sort of game that will run really nicely on the 5600G, albeit with the low preset and dynamic resolution set to a minimum of 75%. Now, when setting this to 100% resolution, you will see a lot more dips below 60 FPS. The average is going to sit at around 60, but there will be a few more drops. So I think it's best to enable a dynamic resolution here. I left things as default, so a minimum of 75% scaling, up to 100% scaling of course, and the game felt absolutely fine to play, very smooth on this hardware and very consistent, which is what you want in an online fast-paced shooter such as this. Cyberpunk 2077 was probably the hardest game to run on this chip today, at least in terms of smooth gameplay. We're looking at the lowest settings with FSR 3 performance. Now I specifically mentioned FSR 3 here because this has a couple of choices, FSR 2.2 I think it is, or 2.1, and FSR 3. There isn't much of a performance difference with the 5600G here, so I just enabled 3 because it can look a little sharper at the lower settings. You will get away with over 30 frames per second, but it's not going to feel all too pleasant to play, to be honest, so I think Cyberpunk 2077 is perhaps best avoided with a 5600G, though if you really want to play it, you can do so with some pretty hefty graphical sacrifices here. When it comes to Red Dead Redemption 2, well, this is also quite demanding on the 5600G, more so than you might anticipate going into it. We're using 1080p with the ultra textures and everything else set to lowest. TAA was set to medium, and the resolution scale was set to 80%, again because this performs better than FSR, which doesn't seem to do a thing in this game. Like, you can enable FSR balance mode or whatever, and the performance stays the same, especially with the 5600G, so adjusting the resolution scale is a better option. Even so, there are going to be quite a few dips, especially around Valentine here. I've just stolen this little horse and cart, riding it off into the countryside, where the frame rate will pick up perhaps a tiny bit, but there are still going to be a few issues. Let's finalise with Fortnite. 1080p performance mode, 100% resolution scale and view distance set to far, along with textures and meshes set to high as well. This one performs with at least 60 frames per second with percentile lows of 79 and 57. A very nice experience in Fortnite here, albeit in performance mode, which is certainly the better option for AMD's APUs. All in all then, there we have it. The 5600G is going to get a better cooler for future videos, because I plan to keep it and test it with all new releases just to see how well it can do and what sort of visual sacrifices we have to make. I'm going to make this sort of the default iGPU gaming chip, so for those future gaming without a graphics card videos, we're going to be using this thing, as I think it's a sort of nice middle ground of APUs, less expensive than the 5700G, far more capable than the Athlon 3000G, and it's on a platform that is, I think, still widely accessible and a lot more affordable than more modern options. But there we are. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.